21 Japanese fighters climbed out of Rabaul that morning, and only one American pilot flew straight into the middle of them. His name was Robert Hanson, 23 years old, 21 confirmed kills in 17 days, 1 week left before he was scheduled to sail home. The math that day made no sense. 8 Marine Corsairs against a fortress of 70 enemy aircraft, protecting 18 torpedo bombers that could not defend themselves. Every other pilot held formation. Hanson did not. He rolled his Corsair inverted and dropped straight into the enemy swarm, alone, outnumbered more than 20 to 1. What happened in the next 4 minutes would scatter a Japanese formation, save a squadron of bombers, and leave his own aircraft riddled with 47 bullet holes. He would land with his engine dying, his hydraulics gone, and half his controls shredded. Pilots on the ground would give him a nickname that followed him for the rest of his short life: Butcher Bob. But the real story is not just what he did in the sky over Rabaul. It is what he chose to do 3 days later, when he no longer had to fly at all. At 06:15 on January 30th, 1944, First Lieutenant Robert Hanson climbed into the cockpit of his F4U Corsair on the muddy strip at Piva North Airfield, Bougainville. The air still carried the damp weight of the tropical night, thick with the smell of aviation fuel, wet coral dust, and the faint rot of jungle pressing in against the perimeter wire. Around him, 18 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers taxied into position, their engines coughing black smoke into the gray dawn light, the sound rolling low across the airstrip like distant thunder that never quite arrived. Ground crews moved between the aircraft with flashlights, checking fuel caps, wiring, the last details that meant the difference between a man coming home or not. He was 23 years old. In the past 17 days, he had shot down 21 Japanese aircraft. In exactly 1 week, he was scheduled to board a transport ship bound for Pearl Harbor, and then home, to a country that had already started printing his name in newspapers he had never seen. The mission brief that morning was simple to describe and almost impossible to survive. 8 Marine Corsairs would escort 18 unarmed torpedo bombers into Simpson Harbor, the fortified anchorage at Rabaul, where Japanese intelligence had counted 70 fighter aircraft standing ready. Since November, the Marine Corps had lost 43 pilots over that same stretch of water and jungle. The Japanese knew every approach vector by heart. Radar stations crowned every hilltop around the harbor. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the water like a fence of fire, so dense that pilots who had survived a run over Simpson Harbor described the sky itself as turning black and orange, the air shuddering with each burst. Hanson had flown this math before. He understood exactly what it meant, and he understood it the way a man understands a debt that never stops accruing interest, one flight at a time, one squadron mate at a time. He had arrived in the South Pacific in June of 1943, assigned to Marine Fighting Squadron 214, the Black Sheep Squadron. His first kill came on August 4th, a lone Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony over Vela La Vela, a quiet, almost accidental beginning to what would become one of the most violent flying records in the Pacific War. By the end of that month, he had 2 confirmed victories. Then came November 1st, over Empress Augusta Bay, during the landings at Bougainville. 6 Japanese torpedo bombers came in low over the water, aiming for the invasion beaches packed with Marines who had no cover and nowhere to run. Hanson attacked them alone. He forced 3 of the bombers to jettison their bombs before they could reach the shore, and shot down 3 more outright. In the middle of that fight, a rear gunner on a Nakajima B-5N2 Kate found his fuel tank with a burst of machine gun fire. Hanson brought his burning Corsair down into the ocean and spent 6 hours alone in a rubber life raft, the salt water stinging in every cut on his hands, the sun burning down without mercy through the long middle hours of the afternoon, watching the horizon, listening for engines, waiting to find out whether anyone had seen him go down at all. The destroyer USS Sigourney found him after dark, a searchlight sweeping across black water until it caught the small orange shape of the raft and the exhausted man inside it. He should have been finished by then. Instead, in October, he transferred to Marine Fighting Squadron 215, the Fighting Corsairs. By early January of 1944, his total stood at 5 confirmed kills, a respectable record for most pilots, an ordinary chapter in a war full of ordinary courage. Then, without warning, something in him changed. On January 14th, over Simpson Harbor, Hanson got separated from his squadron during a high-altitude escort mission. He found himself alone above a formation of Japanese fighters that were climbing to intercept the American bombers below. Any reasonable pilot would have used the separation as an excuse to disengage, to find his squadron and rejoin formation. Hanson did not. He rolled his Corsair over and dove straight into the middle of the enemy formation. In 12 minutes, he shot down 5 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. He landed back at Piva North with 14 bullet holes in his aircraft and 3 gallons of fuel left in the tank. That night, the other pilots in his squadron started calling him Butcher Bob. The nickname spread fast, the way nicknames do when they describe something men have actually witnessed with their own eyes. January 20th, 1-0 destroyed. January 22nd, 2 zeros and a Tony. January 24th, 4 more zeros in another solo engagement after he was cut off from his division over Simpson Harbor, an action that would later be described in his Medal of Honor citation as a lone and gallant battle against hostile interceptors, fought with what the citation called devastating fury. January 26th, 3 more zeros fell to his guns, 16 days, 21 confirmed kills. Robert Hanson was not what anyone expected a killer to look like. He was the son of Methodist missionaries, born and raised in India, a former wrestling champion in Lucknow before he ever set foot on an American airfield. He spoke quietly. He was polite to ground crews, remembered the names of the mechanics who patched his aircraft night after night, and wrote long letters home that never once mentioned how many men he had killed that week. And yet in the air he became someone else entirely, a pilot who flew with a cold, mathematical precision that unsettled even the men who admired him most. He did not wait for combat to come to him. He hunted it, the way some men hunt a debt they intend to collect in full before anyone can stop them. When Japanese formations appeared on the horizon, the other pilots in his squadron closed ranks and held their positions, trusting in numbers and discipline. Hanson broke formation. Every time. He dove straight into the enemy, alone, again and again, as if the odds simply did not apply to him. His commanding officer, Major Robert Owens, had tried to ground him twice. Both times, Owens told him plainly that he had done enough, that no one would think less of him for flying safer, more conservative missions for his final days in theater. Hanson was scheduled to rotate home on February 10th. 1 week from that morning, he would be standing on the deck of a transport ship, watching Bougainville disappear behind him for good, trading the smell of aviation fuel and jungle rot for the smell of his mother's kitchen, for a life where no one kept count of how many men he had killed before breakfast. But January 30th was different from any of the routine missions that had filled the weeks before it. Intelligence had picked up signs of a major Japanese convoy movement near Rabaul, ships gathering in Simpson Harbor under the cover of the base's fighter umbrella. Every available bomber in the sector would be thrown at that convoy. Every available fighter would be flying escort. There would be no easing into this final week. There would only be Rabaul, one more time, at its most heavily defended. If you want to see how Hanson's last hunt over Rabaul actually unfolded, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps us bring more forgotten stories like this one to more people who need to hear them. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because there are dozens more stories just like this waiting to be told. Back to Hanson, standing beside his Corsair in the wet, gray dawn. The briefing officer had marked the approach on the map in red grease pencil. The strike force would come in from the southeast. The bombers would hold at 12,000 feet. The fighters would fly high cover at 15,000. Expected enemy response, massive. The kind of word briefing officers only used when they meant it. Hanson walked out to his aircraft through the mud and the pale early light, boots sinking into ground still soft from the night's rain. Bureau number 56039, the same Corsair he had flown for the better part of a month, the same inverted gull-wing fighter that had carried him through 6 consecutive missions over the most heavily defended target left in the Pacific. The ground crew chief handed him his parachute without a word, the kind of silence that passed for good luck between men who had stopped believing in speeches. Hanson climbed into the cockpit, settled into the familiar shape of the seat, and ran his hands over switches he could have found blind. The engine caught on the third blade, and the distinctive roar of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp filled the humid air. 2,000 horsepower straining against the propeller, the whole airframe trembling on its wheels like something alive and impatient to be gone. At 0648, Hanson taxied into position at the head of the runway. The Corsair ahead of him lifted off the strip and banked away toward the sea. Then it was his turn. The engine roared louder, the airfield fell away beneath him, and Bougainville's jungle canopy stretched out green and endless in every direction as he climbed to join the formation gathering above. By 0730, the strike force crossed the northern coast of Bougainville, 90 miles of open ocean stretching ahead of them toward Simpson Harbor. Hanson checked his ammunition, 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 400 rounds each, 2,400 rounds in total, every one of them accounted for and ready. Over the radio, the bomber leader called out the final approach vector. The Corsair pilots acknowledged, one after another, calm and clipped. Hanson switched to the squadron frequency. And then, somewhere ahead in the brightening sky, someone spotted them. 21 Japanese fighters, climbing hard out of Rabaul to meet the incoming strike, rising in tight, disciplined formation to intercept 8 Marine Corsairs and 18 defenseless bombers with nowhere left to run and no one left to call for help. The bomber leader's voice cracked over the radio, flat and urgent. Bandits, high, 12 o'clock, climbing. 8 Corsair pilots acknowledged in turn, their voices tight but controlled. Standard doctrine said hold formation, protect the bombers, let the enemy come to you, and meet them with concentrated fire. 7 of the 8 pilots did exactly that, tucking in tighter around the vulnerable Avengers below. Hanson rolled his Corsair inverted and dove. The other 7 held their positions. They had watched him do this before, and they understood the tactic even as it terrified them. One fighter would slash through the enemy formation, disrupt the attack before it could form, and draw the swarm away from the bombers and onto himself. It was tactically sound. It was also close to suicidal. 21 against 1 meant Hanson would likely be dead within 90 seconds of engaging. The Corsair accelerated through 400 miles an hour in the dive, the airframe shuddering with the speed, the ocean and jungle blurring together far below. Hanson picked his target, the lead 0 at the head of the Japanese formation. Kill the leader, scatter the rest. An old and brutal logic that had worked for him 17 times already this month. At 800 yards, the Japanese pilot spotted him, and the formation began, too late, to break and turn. Hanson had altitude. He had speed. The lead 0 grew larger in his gun sight. 600 yards, 500. The enemy fighter turning hard left in a desperate attempt to evade. At 400 yards, Hanson pressed the trigger, and all 650 caliber machine guns opened fire together. 6 streams of tracer converging into a single point at 300 yards, exactly where the 0 happened to be. The fighter shuddered, pieces tearing away from the engine cowling, black smoke pouring back across the fuselage. The 0 rolled over and fell into a spin that did not stop until it disappeared into the water far below. 1 down, 20 remained. Hanson pulled out of the dive at 5,000 feet, his speed carrying him straight through the scattering Japanese formation before they could reorganize. He reversed course and climbed. Below and behind him, 15 Zeros broke off to pursue the single Corsair that had just torn through their ranks, while 6 continued on toward the bombers, exactly as Hanson had gambled they might not. The tactical goal, at least in part, had been achieved. The formation was broken. The bombers had breathing room, but Hanson now had 15 Japanese fighters converging on his tail, and the nearest one was closing fast. At 280 yards, the lead Zero opened fire. Tracers streaked past his canopy, one round punching through the vertical stabilizer, another tearing into the left wing root. Neither hit was critical, but the message was unmistakable. Hanson pushed the throttle to maximum power, the engine screaming, and kept climbing, but the Zero was climbing faster, the gap closing yard by yard. At 240 yards, he snap-rolled hard right, a maneuver the heavier Corsair could execute faster than any Zero could follow. The pursuing fighter tried to match the roll and could not. Hanson came out of it already diving, already building speed, the distance behind him opening again. He leveled off at 3,000 feet and pulled the stick back, sending the Corsair into a near vertical climb, the airspeed bleeding away with every 1,000 feet gained. At the top of the climb, he rolled inverted and looked down. 14 Japanese fighters were scattered below him, across 5,000 feet of open sky, searching, no longer a formation at all but a loose scatter of individual hunters who had lost their target during his climb. The discipline that had defined them minutes earlier had come apart completely. Hanson had the one thing that mattered most in this kind of fight: altitude. He rolled right and dove on the nearest Zero, coming in from directly above and behind, the blind spot every fighter pilot feared. The Japanese pilot never saw him. At 300 yards, Hanson opened fire, all 6 guns hammering out 80 rounds a second into a space smaller than a bathtub. The Zero came apart in the air, the right wing folding upward, the fuselage splitting in two. No parachute followed it down. 2 down, 19 remained. But now every Japanese pilot in the sky knew exactly where the lone Corsair was. Tracers converged on him from 3 directions at once. Hanson hauled the stick hard left, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. 4G, 5G, the edges of his vision fading to gray at the corners. 3 Zeros pursued directly. He leveled off and accelerated to over 400 miles an hour, opening the distance, but 4 more fighters were climbing from below and ahead to cut off his escape, a pincer he spotted only at 800 yards. 7 Japanese fighters, 3 behind him and 4 ahead, all converging on a single American aircraft. Hanson pulled into another vertical climb, trusting the Corsair's superior power-to-weight ratio below 10,000 feet. The altimeter unwound upward. 8,000, 9, 10. The 4 Zeros ahead were still climbing to meet him, closing the gap. 700 yards, 600, 500. At 450 yards, both sides opened fire in the same instant, tracers filling the space between the converging aircraft. Hanson's rounds found the lead Zero's engine, and it rolled away trailing smoke and fire. 3 down, 18 remained. But return fire from the other 3 fighters stitched across his own Corsair in the same pass, one round punching through the instrument panel in a spray of shattered glass, another tearing a 2-foot hole through the fabric skin of the right wing, a third slamming into the armor plate behind his seat. The plate held. It was the only thing standing between Robert Hanson and the ocean below. He rolled inverted and dove again, the 3 Zeros unable to match his roll rate, and came out heading south at nearly 400 miles an hour. Below him, the remaining Japanese fighters were no longer scattering. They were reforming into a tight, rotating circle, a defensive formation the Americans called the Lufberry Circle, where each fighter covered the tail of the one ahead of it. Any pilot who dove on one aircraft in that circle would immediately find himself in the gun sight of the next. It was, by every rule of aerial combat, a trap that could not be broken by force alone. Hanson climbed to 12,000 feet and circled at a distance, watching. Below, the bombers had already struck Simpson Harbor and were turning for home, escorted by his squadron mates. The mission, in the strictest sense, was complete. Doctrine said disengage, rejoin the formation, escort the bombers home. He had already destroyed 3 enemy fighters and scattered an attack that could have torn the Avengers apart. No one would have blamed him for turning south. 15 Japanese fighters remained in that circle below him, still a threat to any American aircraft that might cross their path on the way home. Hanson checked his ammunition. Roughly 1,600 rounds left, enough for perhaps 2 more extended engagements if he was careful. He rolled the Corsair over and dove, not toward any single fighter, but toward the geometry of the circle itself. He adjusted his dive angle at the last moment, coming in not against the rotation of the circle but along it, matching his direction of travel to theirs, so his closing speed dropped from nearly 800 miles an hour to barely 200. By the time the Japanese pilot spotted him at 600 yards and the circle began to break apart, Hanson was already firing. The nearest Zero's cockpit disintegrated under the impact, and the fighter fell away inverted. 4 down, 17 remained. Instead of climbing away from the wreckage of the formation, Hanson leveled off and flew with the rotation for 3 full seconds, effectively inside the enemy circle, flying alongside them rather than against them. The fighters behind him in the rotation could not fire without hitting their own aircraft ahead. The fighters ahead could not turn back without colliding with the fighters behind. For 3 seconds, the entire defensive logic of the Lufberry Circle worked against the men who had built it. Hanson selected the Zero 200 yards ahead of him and fired a 2-second burst. The fighter's left wing sheared away and its snap rolled into a flat, uncontrollable spin. 5 down, 16 remained. The circle shattered completely. Fighters broke away in every direction, 3 rolling left, 4 rolling right, the rest scattering vertically. The mutual protection that had defined the formation seconds earlier no longer existed. What remained was a furball, individual aircraft maneuvering on instinct, and somewhere in the middle of it, one battered American Corsair with over 3,000 rounds already spent. 2 Zeros closed on his tail at 400 yards. Hanson executed a split S, rolling inverted and pulling through into a dive that cost him almost no altitude, the maneuver so tight that both pursuers, better at turning than rolling, could not close the gap. He spotted another Zero ahead, unaware of him entirely, and fired from 500 yards, a low-probability shot that nonetheless found the enemy's tail section, tearing away the vertical stabilizer and sending the fighter into an uncontrolled yaw toward the ocean far below. 6 down, 15 remained. But 5 Japanese fighters had now formed a loose gaggle directly behind him, and the lead aircraft opened fire from 300 yards. Tracers walked up the left side of his fuselage, one round striking the canopy rail inches from his head, another punching through the fuselage just behind the cockpit, a third tearing into the left main landing gear door. Hanson felt the Corsair shudder in a way it had not shuddered before. Red hydraulic fluid began streaming back along the fuselage in a fine, visible mist. The system was failing. He pushed the throttle toward maximum continuous power, aware that the engine temperature gauge had already begun climbing into territory he did not like. 5 Zeros held formation behind him now, disciplined, rotating the attack so that when Hanson maneuvered to evade one, another was already sliding into position to fire, the same grinding tactic that had broken so many other American pilots over this stretch of ocean. Hanson understood the geometry as well as any pilot in the Pacific by now, having lived inside it 21 times in the past 17 days. The answer was not evasion. It never had been. He pulled into another vertical climb, the airspeed dropping fast, and the lighter Zeros climbed with him, closing a gap that should never have existed at this altitude. At the top of the climb, he rolled inverted and pulled through into a hammerhead turn, hanging motionless in the sky for half a second before falling nose first directly at the climbing formation below him. A head-on pass closing at nearly 700 miles an hour combined, with barely 3 seconds to find a firing solution before the aircraft passed each other entirely. Most of the Japanese pilots broke away rather than accept the head-on engagement. One did not, trusting his aircraft's legendary turning ability to win whatever came after the pass. Hanson fired at 400 yards, accounting for the impossible geometry of 2 aircraft converging at high speed, and 20 rounds found the Zero's engine, the cowling exploding outward in a spray of burning oil across his own windscreen. 7 down, 14 remained. But the pass had cost him badly, bleeding away both altitude and speed, and he leveled off at 5,000 feet, doing barely 260 miles an hour, with 6 fresh fighters closing in to join what remained of the gaggle. The engine temperature gauge sat firmly in the yellow now. The coolant leak had worsened into a visible streaming mist, trailing back from the cowling. Hanson climbed again, more gradually, at a shallow 30-degree angle meant to conserve what energy remained, and the 6 Zeros climbed with him, a disciplined pair leading 4 more in trail. At 8,000 feet he rolled right and dived, not to escape but to reposition, then leveled off and reversed course directly back toward his pursuers. The Zeros were stacked vertically below him, 2 pairs and a lead element spread across 1,000 feet of altitude. Hanson targeted the lowest pair at 600 yards, closing at nearly 700 miles an hour combined, both sides opening fire in the same heartbeat. His rounds tore into the right-hand Zero's wing root, and the wing folded away entirely. 8 down, 13 remained. But the left-hand fighter's return fire raked across his own right wing, 3 solid hits, fabric tearing away, metal twisting, and somewhere in that burst the aileron control cable parted with a jolt he felt through the stick itself. The Corsair's right aileron had gone dead. He could still roll left cleanly, but rolling right now required full stick deflection and produced only a sluggish, delayed response. The 5 remaining Zeros from the original gaggle had seen the damage and the coolant streaming from his engine, and pressed their attack harder, sensing the American in front of them was wounded. Hanson checked his ammunition counter. Roughly 600 rounds left, enough for 1 more real engagement. The engine temperature gauge crossed into the red. The coolant system had lost too much fluid to sustain itself much longer, and he understood he now had exactly 2 choices. Reduce power and let the pursuing Zeros close the distance, or hold power and risk the engine seizing entirely over open ocean, 90 miles from the nearest friendly airstrip. He held power. At 2,000 feet he leveled out over open water, the ocean a deep, indifferent blue beneath him, white caps marking the swells far below. 5 Zeros closed to 300 yards. The lead fighter fired a long 4-second burst, 30 rounds, and Hanson rolled left, the only direction his crippled aileron would answer quickly, the tracers passing behind him, but the roll itself bleeding away precious speed he could not afford to lose. The engine temperature needle was pinned now, fully in the red, the coolant leak no longer a mist but a visible stream running back along the fuselage in the wind. He pulled into a defensive spiral, an attempt to force an overshoot from pilots who now had every advantage of speed, altitude, and numbers. At 4,000 feet he reversed the spiral, rolling left again, the damaged aileron cable groaning over the roar of the failing engine. 2 Zeros overshot directly in front of his nose, and Hanson fired a single 1-second burst at the nearest, 50 rounds shredding the fighter's tail section and sending it into a flat, uncontrollable spin toward the water. 9 down, 12 remained, but the burst had cost him ammunition he could not replace. 4 Zeros from the immediate pursuit reformed into a bracket, 2 on his left, 2 on his right, a trap with no clean answer. Turn left and the right pair had a clear shot. Turn right and the left pair did. Continue straight and both pairs converged on him at once. Hanson pulled vertical one final time, the airspeed dropping away, the controls growing mushy and unresponsive as the damaged aileron bled away what little authority remained. At the top of the climb he rolled inverted and dove, but this time not toward the Japanese fighters at all. Southeast, toward Bougainville, away from Rabaul entirely. The decision had already made itself. The aircraft was too damaged to continue. The engine was failing. The ammunition was nearly spent. Continuing this fight meant dying in it, and Hanson had never confused courage with a wish to die. The 4 Zeros pursued briefly, the gap opening behind him, until at 600 yards they broke off entirely and turned back toward Rabaul, low on fuel and unwilling to abandon a base that still needed defending. Hanson held his southeast heading, Alone now, the sky suddenly and strangely empty after everything that had just happened inside it. Airspeed 340 miles an hour. Altitude 3,000 feet. Bougainville lay 87 miles ahead, roughly 15 minutes at this speed, if the engine held that long. The temperature gauge remained pinned in the red. Oil pressure had begun falling, 70 pounds per square inch, then 65, then 60, dropping toward the 55-pound threshold where the engine would seize, the propeller would stop, and the Corsair would become a glider with barely 3 miles of range, not nearly enough to reach land. He eased back on the throttle slightly, sacrificing speed for whatever mercy it might buy the failing engine, and the oil pressure held, briefly, at 58 pounds. Below him the ocean stretched out empty, no ships, no rescue vessels, nothing but water, and the growing certainty that if the engine failed here, he would be as alone as he had been 6 hours in that life raft back in November, except this time there might be no destroyer searching the dark water for him at all. 10 miles from Bougainville, the oil pressure began falling again, 58, 56, 54, the bearings running dry, metal grinding against metal in a way he could feel through the airframe. The coastline appeared ahead, green jungle and white beach, and beyond it the runway at Piva North, close enough now to see the dispersal areas where his squadron mates were already landing, safe, unaware of what was happening in the sky behind them. At 50 pounds, the engine began to knock, a deep, rhythmic hammering that meant a cylinder was failing outright. 5 miles from the runway, Hanson keyed his radio and transmitted, his voice flat and economical. Aircraft damaged. Engine failing. Requesting priority landing. The tower answered immediately, already rolling fire trucks toward the approach end of the strip, standard procedure for any aircraft calling in like that. The oil pressure fell to 42 pounds. The engine hammered violently now, multiple cylinders misfiring in a ragged, uneven rhythm, the entire airframe shaking with it. Hanson dropped his landing gear, only to find the hydraulic system had failed completely, and pulled the emergency manual extension handle instead, watching 3 green lights appear on the panel one after another. The mechanical backup had survived where everything else had not. He crossed the coastline at 1,000 feet, the airfield 2 miles ahead, the runway clearly visible, fire trucks already rolling. At 38 pounds of oil pressure, the engine seized entirely. The propeller stopped turning. The hammering ceased all at once, replaced by a silence that felt, after everything that had come before it, almost peaceful. The Corsair was now a glider, descending at 800 feet a minute, 1 mile from the threshold, 900 feet of altitude remaining, roughly a minute left in the air. Hanson adjusted his glide path with the small, precise corrections of a man who understood exactly how little margin he had left. Too steep and he would fall short. Too shallow and he would overshoot into the jungle beyond the strip. At 500 feet he was aligned with the runway centerline. At 200 feet the approach was stable. At 100 feet he flared the descent at the last possible moment, and the main gear touched down 140 feet past the threshold. The dead Corsair rolling to a stop 800 feet down the strip, surrounded within seconds by fire trucks and ground crew, who had watched the entire silent approach with their hearts in their throats. Hanson shut down what remained of his systems and climbed out onto the wing, and it was only then, legs unsteady beneath him, that he had time to actually look at the aircraft that had carried him home. It looked as though it had flown through a metal shredder, 47 bullet holes across the fuselage and wings. The right aileron hanging by 2 frayed cables. A 3-foot section of fabric torn away from the left wing. The engine cowling blackened and cracked, oil coating the right side of the fuselage in a thick, dark sheen. The vertical stabilizer alone had taken 6 hits. The rudder had 4 more. The ground crew moved over the wreckage with chalk, marking each impact point, photographing the damage for the maintenance log that would decide whether Bureau number 56039 could be repaired or written off. An intelligence officer arrived with a clipboard, asking the questions that always came after a mission like this one. How many enemy aircraft encountered? How many engaged? How many destroyed? Confirmed or probable? Hanson answered quietly and reported 9 enemy fighters destroyed. The claim went into the record, but claims alone meant nothing without confirmation. Gun camera footage, witness testimony, wreckage verified. The other 7 pilots, already back on the ground, gave what statements they could, having seen Hanson dive alone into the formation and scatter it, but the fight had been too fast and too far away for exact counts. That afternoon, the gun camera film was reviewed frame by frame. 3 kills appeared with total clarity. Cross-referenced against witness statements and intercepted radio traffic, intelligence confirmed 1 more. 4 victories, officially credited, 2 zeros and 2 tojos. The other 5 claims were downgraded to probables, and probables did not count toward a man's official score. 4 confirmed kills brought Hanson's total to 25, tying him with Captain Joseph Foss and Major Gregory Boyington for the highest score among active Marine Corps pilots in the Pacific, one behind Captain Eddie Rickenbacker's record from the previous war. War correspondents reached the airfield that evening, wanting photographs, wanting the story of the lone Corsair pilot who had gone up against 21 Japanese fighters and flown home. By morning, his name was already running in newspapers across the United States, read by people who would never know what the inside of that cockpit had actually sounded like. That night, the squadron held an informal celebration, the other pilots calling him the hottest fighter pilot in the entire Allied South Pacific. Major Owens presented him with an unofficial certificate naming him the top-scoring Corsair pilot in theater, then pulled him aside and reminded him he was still scheduled to rotate home in 9 days. February 10th, a transport ship to Pearl Harbor, and then, finally, the United States. No more missions. Hanson acknowledged the order, thanked his commanding officer, and walked back to his tent through the dark, saying nothing else about it at all. February 3, 1944 began with clear skies over Bougainville, the kind of morning that gave no warning of what it was about to take. The rains that had soaked the airstrip for weeks had finally broken overnight, and the ground crews moved through the pale early light with an ease that had been missing from every previous mission that month, the mud finally firm enough underfoot to walk without sinking. The mission brief that day was, by the standards of the past 2 weeks, almost routine. 8 F4U Corsairs would escort 18 TBF Avengers to Tobera Airfield near Rabaul, strike the runway, destroy whatever aircraft sat parked in the open, and return to base by early afternoon. Hanson was not on the flight schedule. His combat tour was effectively over. 4 days earlier, he had come home with 47 bullet holes in his aircraft and a dead engine, and by any reasonable measure, he had already given this war more than anyone had the right to ask of a 23-year-old pilot. He was supposed to be processing paperwork that morning, packing his gear, counting down the last week before the transport ship that would carry him back to Pearl Harbor and then home. But one of the scheduled pilots woke that morning with severe stomach illness, doubled over in his tent, unable to fly. The squadron needed a replacement, and it needed one within the hour. Hanson volunteered. Major Owens tried to talk him out of it. He reminded Hanson, plainly and directly, that he had already done enough. 25 confirmed kills, a Medal of Honor recommendation already working its way up through the chain of command, a Navy Cross already awarded for the fighting back in November. There was no shortage of reasons for Hanson to stay on the ground that day, and Owens gave him every one of them, standing in the doorway of the operations tent, with the same tired patience he had shown the 2 other times he had tried to ground this particular pilot. Hanson listened without arguing, the way he always did, and then he said the squadron was short 1 pilot, and he was available, and he was qualified, and he intended to fly. Owens looked at him for a long moment, searching for some sign of hesitation that never came, and then signed the authorization. Bureau number 56039 had been repaired in the 4 days since its last flight. The engine replaced, the shredded aileron rebuilt, the 47 bullet holes patched over with new fabric and fresh paint. The aircraft that had barely carried him home from Rabaul was, on paper at least, airworthy again. At 0720, the formation lifted off from Piva North and turned northeast, following a route Hanson could have flown with his eyes closed by now, across the Bougainville Strait, past New Ireland, curving in from the southeast toward Rabaul one final time. The strike itself went almost exactly as planned. The Avengers dropped their bombs across Tobera Airfield, and secondary explosions rolling up from the impact points suggested they had found a fuel storage area. The Corsair escort met 15 Japanese fighters rising to intercept and shot down 3 of them without losing a single American aircraft. By any measure, it was a clean, successful mission, the kind that ended with every pilot going home to write an ordinary letter about an ordinary day, the kind of mission that should have marked the quiet, forgettable end of Robert Hanson's time in the Pacific. The formation turned southeast for the return flight, following the coastline of New Ireland toward Cape St. George, the southern tip of the island where a white lighthouse stood over the water, its black cap visible for miles in the clear morning light. The Japanese used the lighthouse as an observation post, its elevated view feeding reports back to anti-aircraft crews and radar stations scattered across the hillside below it. As the formation crossed Kabanga Bay, Hanson broke away from the group. He dove toward Cape St. George alone, the lighthouse growing larger beneath him, white stone and a black roof against the green hillside and the blue water beyond. The other pilots saw him go and called out over the radio, asking what he was doing, telling him to rejoin the formation. Hanson did not answer. Whatever reasoning moved through his mind in that moment, whether it was the same restless hunger that had sent him diving alone into 21 Japanese fighters 4 days earlier, or something quieter and more personal that no one would ever fully understand, he was already committed to the attack, and he was not turning back. At 1,000 feet, Hanson opened fire on the lighthouse. His .650 caliber machine guns raked the stone tower, and chips of white masonry exploded outward where the rounds struck home, windows shattering along the length of the structure. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews below responded within seconds, 25mm and 40mm guns opening up from positions Hanson could not see, tracer fire rising to meet him from the hillside in a pattern he had no time to evade. He pulled up out of the strafing run, and his right wing clipped the surface of the water. The impact was catastrophic and immediate. The wing tore away from the fuselage entirely, and the Corsair cartwheeled across the surface of the bay. Hanson fought the controls, trying to level what remained of the aircraft, and for one impossible second it seemed to work, the remaining wing generating just enough lift to carry the crippled fighter briefly upward, 50 feet, then 100. Then the fuel spilling from the torn wing ignited, and a fireball engulfed the aircraft. The blast wave shattered the canopy. The fuselage twisted violently in the air. For one more second, it appeared Hanson might somehow still bring the burning wreck down onto the water in something close to a controlled landing, the Corsair nearly level, its descent rate slowing. Then it snap-rolled inverted and struck the ocean at roughly 140 miles an hour. The aircraft disintegrated on impact, wreckage scattering across 200 yards of open water. The fuselage sank almost immediately. No parachute opened. No life raft appeared on the surface. No transmission ever came over the survival radio. Major Owens, who had turned back to watch over Hanson's solo attack, circled the crash site for 15 minutes, searching the water below for any sign of him, and found only drifting wreckage and a slick of burning fuel spreading slowly across the bay. The War Diary entry for Marine Fighting Squadron 215 that evening was brief, almost unbearably plain against everything that had led up to it. Lieutenant Hanson did not return from this hop. Robert Murray Hanson was 23 years old. He died one day before his 24th birthday, 7 days before he was scheduled to board the transport ship that would have carried him home for good, to the country and the family that had already begun celebrating a homecoming he would never make. He was posthumously promoted to captain and awarded the Medal of Honor, alongside the Navy Cross and Air Medal he had already earned in 6 months of combat over the South Pacific. His name is inscribed on the wall of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery, one name among thousands who were never recovered from the waters and jungles of that war. In 1945, the Navy commissioned a destroyer, USS Hanson, in his honor. In 1968, the Marine Corps Aviation Association established the Robert M. Hanson Award, given every year since to the finest Marine fighter attack squadron in the Corps. The award still exists today. His official record stands at 25 confirmed victories, making him the second highest scoring Marine Corps fighter pilot of the entire war, and to this day, the top scoring pilot to ever fly the F4U Corsair. But the 4 kills credited to him on January 30th were never the whole story of that morning. Gun camera footage was incomplete. Witness statements were fragmentary, gathered from men who had themselves been fighting for their lives in the same chaotic sky. Some historians who have studied the record since believe his true total that day and across his career was higher still, perhaps 27, perhaps closer to 30. The exact number is lost with him, somewhere in the water off Cape St. George, and it will likely never be recovered. What is not lost, what survives clearly enough in the record for anyone to read, is this. On January 30th, 1944, one Marine pilot in one damaged Corsair flew alone into a formation of 21 Japanese fighters over the most heavily defended target in the Pacific. He broke their formation apart, protected 18 bombers and the men inside them, shot down at least 4 enemy aircraft by the strictest official count, and brought his shredded, dying aircraft home on an engine that failed before he ever reached the runway. 4 days later, with nothing left to prove and every reason in the world to stay on the ground, he volunteered to fly one more time. He did not come home from that one. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button right now. Every single like helps YouTube put this story in front of more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are pulling stories like this one out of dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who fought alone, over empty water, far from home, with no one watching but the men flying beside them. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, wherever you are, this community reaches around the entire world, and you are not just watching. You are part of what keeps these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your own family wore a uniform in this war. Just let us know you were here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Robert Hanson does not disappear into silence. Men like him earned the right to be remembered, and you are the ones making that happen.